Hello and welcome to Maiden Mother Matriarch with me, Louise. My guest today is Eliza Mondegreen. She's a graduate student who is interested in the study of gender identity, particularly online trans communities, which we spoke about a lot, particularly online trans communities that attract natal females. We spoke about some of the parallels between this phenomenon and other psychiatric phenomena of the past, like multiple personality disorder. And then in the extended version of the episode, we also spoke about Eliza's undercover visits to conferences for clinicians and patients in terms of gender identity, and some of her conclusions from seeing people in the flesh, in meat space, including some of the physical effects that transition is having on these patients and what kind of long-term consequences there might be. You can find that extended version of the episode at louiseperry.substack.com, and as always, you can also find there bonus episodes and the MMM chat community. Enjoy. So, Eliza, could you start by telling me a bit about your academic background and your interest in transgenderism and I guess how you came to be interested in it as a subject?
Sure. And I first just wanted to say I'm really happy to be here. I've been a big fan of your book and I've loved your podcasts. So it's really a pleasure to talk to
you. Likewise.
So my background, I'm a graduate student and I study kind of like the social context of mental health diagnoses, mental illness. So I first became interested in the subject of gender about 10 years ago. And there were a few years where I knew that there was something going on. And I knew on some subconscious level that there was going to be a cost to looking into it. And so I avoided it. I sense that that's something that a lot of people have been doing over the last several years.
I certainly did.
Yeah. But there were several things that happened both in my personal and professional life that finally pushed me to really, I was like, okay, I have to understand what's going on here. Something is very strange. And I went about it the way that I go about everything, which is I went to the library and moved in and read everything that I could think of. And then everything that would be, referenced that would pique my interest about, the history of medicine and psychiatry, the history of, gender and sexual orientation and the field of sexology, which is really wild. And at the same time, I was hoping to go back to graduate school. And I kept telling myself, okay, take this time. You're in the Library of Congress, every weekend working away, just prepare a research idea and you can do anything you want except gender. Because I didn't think that anybody would be willing to take on that kind of a lightning rod in their department. But every weekend I would go in and I would read about gender and I would write about gender. And I ultimately accepted that I couldn't avoid it. So when I came to graduate school in a program where I study, the social and cultural context of mental illness, I really wanted to focus on online trans communities and the way that they shape the beliefs and expectations and intentions that young people have around transition, particularly that young women have around transition. And I also wanted to study kind of the basis and the points of difference between exploratory and affirmative approaches to working with gender dysphoric youth. So that's kind of how I got where I am.
And what was the response like? So you said that this was 10 years ago that you first became interested. My memory of that time is that it was super not allowed.
Oh, no. Academia. I mean, so I've only gone to graduate school quite recently. I'm in my second year. But 10 years ago, I mean, the first time that I ran into this personally, I was working for a women's rights organization. And that was the first time that I realized that there were certain things that you were no longer allowed to say without being called a word that I had never heard before, which was a TERF. And there was a long period of time where I didn't even go home and Google it. I had no idea what it meant. And I had no idea that there was anybody else who had any reservation.
It just sounds bad though, doesn't it?
It does sound bad.
It does. It's not. Yes, I think now it's been somewhat reclaimed, but definitely 10 years ago, it was not said with a smile.
No, it was not. No, you can tell it was something that it was not a compliment. Even though now I feel like I have a lot of affectionate associations with it. Like I would love to go back and visit Turf Island again sometime soon. Yeah.
It's actually a beautiful day on rainy fascist Turf Island. Anyway, so you're interested in the looking at transgenderism from a sort of psychiatric perspective. Is that a fair way of characterizing it?
Yeah, psychiatric and also just like anthropological.
I mean, am I right that it's still the case that gender identity disorder is in the DSM?
So gender dysphoria is still in the DSM. There's a push through there's the International Classification of diagnoses. I think it's gender incongruence now there, and that's definitely the direction of travel, which is an interesting one. I mean, we can talk about it if you want to, or we can move on.
No, let's. I think that's really interesting because a lot of activists end up in this tricky bind where on the one hand, they don't want to say that having gender identity dysphoria is an illness per se, because it's an identity and it's just as valid as any other, yada yada. But particularly in America, they also need to persuade insurers to pay for often very expensive medical treatment, and so the only way of getting around that is to say that it's a medical disorder, which is quite an interesting predicament.
Yeah, it's a pretty tangled knot. Yeah, so there's been this interesting evolution in the diagnosis over time. So until the early 2000s, mid 2000s, it was gender identity disorder. And so the focus is on, this is a disorder related to identity. Then the focus becomes gender dysphoria. Dysphoria just means, discontent, unhappiness with something. And the push now is toward this gender incongruence, this sense that your body does not match your inner sense of self, whatever that means. And nobody really is very quick to clarify what that means. And I think the reason that we've seen these evolutions, identity disorder was too on the nose. And so, like, why would you help a patient to fix an identity disorder by drugging and operating on the body? It doesn't make sense. So the basis for treatment kind of required a shift in the diagnosis. Gender dysphoria, the problems are a little bit more subtle. And I think a big one is clinicians in this area of medicine have been writing some very big checks that they really hope to cash when it comes to, these treatments in time, we'll be proven right, that this was the right thing to do, to intervene on the body to treat this kind of distress. And the problem is that as the evidence starts to come in, it's not great when it comes to, okay, puberty blocking, was this a good idea? Hormonal and surgical transition, has this really helped patients in the long term? And so as that evidence fails to come in and is in fact evidence of medical harm and regret and detransition mount, the focus needs to shift again. And gender incongruence, I think it has two main selling points. One of them is, what I'm talking about here, which is if you treat someone's gender incongruence, you don't have the expectation that it is going to improve their life. With gender dysphoria, the expectation really should be that if you treat someone for this, other areas of their life should get better. Incongruence doesn't make those promises. The other thing about gender incongruence is it's very convenient it's kind of endlessly expandable in terms of like, what does it open up in terms of medical frontiers? Maybe you or I could have gender incongruence too, even though I think we're both pretty happy to be women. But, you could always be, a different kind of woman. You could be, when you read the literature on like women who seek, plastic surgery, cosmetic surgery for, breast reduction, breast enhancement, all of these other things, they're always talking about, well, I always really felt like a big busted woman, or I always felt like a flat chested woman. Gender incongruence could fall under all of those too. And the other thing that gender incongruence does is that it doesn't promise that clinicians are working on something that is fixed. So it allows a patient's desires for interventions to change over time, including to change in the direction of regret and feeling like they have been harmed. And it lets clinicians off the hook because it says, well, we treated your sense of gender incongruence. You didn't want breasts, and so we gave you a mastectomy, and so it was a success, even if the rest of your life didn't get better, and even if you regretted it later. And now you just have a new form of gender incongruence that we can also treat.
It's like, well, you made your request, we fulfilled it, off you go.
Yes, it's a very like a service provider model,
Yeah.
and not a medical assessment model.
Yeah. Thank you so much for watching that episode of Maiden Mother Matriarch and for all of your support. It means an enormous amount for the growth of the show. If you want to hear bonus content, an extra 20, 30 minutes of conversation with the guest, maybe a little bit more personal, a little bit less filtered, then you can go to my Substack at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can sign up for extended episodes and also bonus episodes. And you can also access our chat community. You can also support the show by subscribing on YouTube or subscribing wherever you get your podcasts, and rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts is also really great for encouraging other people to give the show a try. Please also spread the word, tell people that you know who you think might like it to give it a shot. The word of mouth effect is really valuable, so we'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening, watching, and supporting what we're doing.